A little girl's desperate whisper about being locked in a bathroom all night by her stepmother would forever change the course of many lives. What started as a disturbing confession from an innocent child would soon draw the attention of someone with both the means and determination to intervene. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rain pummeled the windows of the Edgehaven Community Library that Thursday afternoon, matching the gloomy atmosphere that had settled over the coastal New England town. 6-year-old Ellie pushed through the heavy oak doors, her small frame drenched from head to toe, blonde hair plastered to her pale face. Her pink backpack hung limply from one shoulder, water dripping onto the polished floor as she stood trembling in the entrance. Margaret Lenley, the head librarian for over 20 years, immediately noticed the child's distress. Something about the little girl's demeanor, beyond just being soaked by the downpour, sent alarm bells ringing through her experienced mind. "Goodness, sweetheart, you're absolutely drenched," she said, hurrying over with a small towel kept behind the desk for rainy days. Ellie didn't respond immediately. Her wide blue eyes darted nervously around the room, as though checking if anyone else could hear. Then, with tiny fingers clutching desperately at Mrs. Lenley's cardigan sleeve, she stood on tiptoes and whispered words that sent ice through the librarian's veins. "My stepmom locked me in the bathroom all night," Ellie murmured, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "I was so cold and scared." Mrs. Lenley froze, the gravity of the child's words sinking in. She'd known Vanessa, Ellie's stepmother, from various charity functions, always impeccably dressed, always wearing that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Across the room, Harrison Vale stood near the rare books collection, carefully handing over a leather-bound first edition to the library's curator. At 43, the millionaire real estate magnate cut an impressive figure, despite his deliberate attempts to avoid attention. His donation complete, he turned to leave when Ellie's whispered confession reached his ears. Harrison stopped mid-stride. Something in the child's words pierced through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself since losing his own daughter 3 years ago. The familiar ache in his chest suddenly transformed into something else, a stirring of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He watched as the librarian gently guided Ellie toward the children's section, offering her hot chocolate from the staff room. The little girl's shoulders remained hunched, her movements hesitant and fearful, telltale signs Harrison recognized all too well from his philanthropic work with trauma survivors. Without conscious decision, Harrison found himself approaching them. His grief-numbed heart awakened with an unfamiliar urgency, a protective instinct he thought had died alongside his daughter. As he drew closer, Ellie looked up at him with eyes that reflected a pain no child should know, and in that moment something fundamental shifted in Harrison Vale's world. Edgehaven wasn't just a town, it was a performance. Nestled along the rocky New England coastline, its Victorian homes and manicured gardens served as the perfect backdrop for the theater of social standing. Here, charity galas weren't about charity so much as being seen giving to charity. Garden parties weren't about gardens, but about who attended them. The pristine, white church steeple that dominated the skyline seemed to watch over it all with silent judgment. Vanessa Hargrove epitomized Edgehaven's values. With her perfect blonde hair and catalog-worthy wardrobe, she moved through town like royalty. "Poor Vanessa," the locals would whisper at the country club, taking on her husband's child after his tragic disappearance. Her performance as the grieving widow and selfless stepmother had earned her not just sympathy, but admiration. Behind the heavy oak door of her colonial home, however, Vanessa's mask fell away. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by cold calculation. 6-year-old Ellie had learned to read these shifts like weather patterns, sunny smiles for visitors that transformed into thunderous rage once they left. "Children should be seen, not heard," Vanessa would remind Ellie whenever guests were expected. And sometimes, she'd add with a tight smile, not even seen. 2 years had passed since Lucas, Ellie's father, had vanished during what Vanessa called an extended business trip. At first, Ellie had asked questions daily. When was Daddy coming home? Why didn't he call? The questions were met with increasingly harsh punishments until Ellie learned that silence was safer. The girl's world shrank to a careful routine. Wake up, dress in the approved outfit, eat breakfast in silence, attend school, return home, complete homework at the kitchen table, eat dinner, bathe, and sleep. Deviations resulted in consequences: missed meals, confiscated toys, or worse, confinement in the dark bathroom with its cold tile floor. What made Edgehaven the perfect prison was its collective obsession with appearances. When Ellie's teacher noticed bruises, Vanessa explained them away as playground accidents. When the girl grew thin, it was just a picky eating phase. The community, eager to maintain its polished veneer, accepted these explanations without question. "Children are so resilient," the townsfolk would say at Vanessa's lavish fundraisers, watching Ellie stand quietly in her pressed dress. They never noticed how the child's eyes constantly tracked her stepmother's movements, anticipating moods, avoiding triggers. They never questioned why such a young child seemed so unnaturally still and quiet. In Edgehaven, truth was an unwelcome guest, especially when it threatened to tarnish reputations as carefully maintained as the town's historic facades. Harrison Vale stood in his oceanfront mansion, staring at the collection of antique clocks that lined the mahogany shelves. Each timepiece marked the seconds with precision. Yet for Harrison, time had stopped 3 years ago, when his daughter's life was cut tragically short. The rhythmic ticking that once brought him comfort now only emphasized the silence that engulfed his home. The real estate magnate's reputation throughout Edgehaven was well established. His sharp business acumen had built an empire worth millions, but few in town knew the man behind the wealth. Since his loss, Harrison had retreated from public life, finding solace in solitude and the constant, predictable movement of his clocks. The memory of little Ellie's whispered confession at the library haunted him. Her trembling voice had pierced through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. "My stepmom locked me in the bathroom all night." Those words echoed in his mind, stirring something he thought had died with his daughter, a fierce protective instinct. Harrison moved to the window overlooking the Atlantic. The waves crashed against the cliffs below, mirroring the turmoil within him. He had recognized the fear in Ellie's eyes, the same fear he'd failed to notice in his own daughter before it was too late. This time, he wouldn't look away. The following morning, Harrison made a call to Dr. Bennett at the local clinic. "I need to arrange a discreet medical examination for a child I believe is being mistreated," he explained, his voice steady with newfound purpose. The wealthy recluse then contacted his attorney, setting in motion a series of inquiries about Ellie's home situation. His resources, dormant for years, were now focused on a single goal: ensuring this child's safety. Harrison knew his actions would draw attention. Edgehaven thrived on gossip, and a millionaire taking interest in the welfare of a local girl would certainly raise eyebrows. Yet for the first time since his daughter's passing, he felt something beyond grief, a sense of purpose. When he arranged for Ellie to visit the clinic, Harrison waited in the reception area, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his smartphone. He had expected resistance, but nothing prepared him for the fury that burst through the clinic doors. Vanessa stormed in, her carefully applied makeup unable to mask her rage. The socialite's eyes narrowed when she spotted Harrison, and in that moment he recognized something dangerous in her expression, the look of someone who would do anything to maintain control. Harrison rose to his feet, steeling himself for the confrontation. The battle lines were drawn, and he knew with absolute certainty that Ellie's whispered words in the library had changed everything, for her, for Vanessa, and for himself. The clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Vanessa's perfectly contoured face as she stormed through the waiting room. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the linoleum floor, turning heads throughout the small Edgehaven medical facility. "What gives you the right?" she hissed at Harrison Vale, who stood calmly beside the pediatrician's office door. The millionaire's composure only seemed to fuel her rage. "You have absolutely no authority to bring my stepdaughter here without my consent." Harrison maintained his steady gaze. "Ellie needed medical attention. I simply facilitated what any responsible adult would do." "Responsible?" Vanessa's voice rose, drawing concerned glances from the clinic staff. "You're a recluse who barely leaves that mausoleum you call home. Now suddenly you're an expert on parenting?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "I know what you're doing. You lost your daughter, so now you're fixating on mine." A flicker of pain crossed Harrison's face, but he remained composed. "This isn't about me. It's about a 6-year-old girl who deserves proper care." The socialite's perfectly manicured finger jabbed toward his chest. "Stay away from my family. Edgehaven knows me. I chair 3 charity committees and host the Winter Gala. You're just a ghost story people tell at parties." What Vanessa didn't realize as she continued her tirade in the sterile hallway was that Harrison had already set wheels in motion. 2 miles away, in a modest downtown office, Detective Monroe was methodically building a file labeled Ellie/Vanessa. The private investigator, known for his discretion and thoroughness, had been quietly interviewing Ellie's teachers and neighbors for 3 days. "I won't warn you again," Vanessa said, smoothing her silk blouse as she regained her public composure. "This pathetic attempt to find meaning in your empty life ends now." As she turned to leave, the doctor emerged from the examination room with Ellie. The child's eyes widened at the sight of her stepmother, her small hand instinctively tightening around the physician's. "Mrs. Calloway," the doctor began professionally, "we need to discuss some concerning findings." "We'll be discussing nothing," Vanessa interrupted, grabbing Ellie's wrist. "My daughter is perfectly fine. We're leaving." Harrison watched them go, his face unreadable. He pulled out his smartphone and sent a brief message to Detective Monroe. "Proceed as discussed. All resources available." As Vanessa's vehicle pulled away from the clinic, she didn't notice the unmarked car that followed at a discreet distance. The seeds of confrontation had been planted, and Edgehaven's carefully maintained social facade was about to face a storm, unlike any the coastal town had weathered before. The Edgehaven courthouse stood imposing against the gray morning sky as Harrison Vale entered, his shoulders squared with determination. The temporary custody hearing for Ellie had drawn a small crowd of curious townsfolk. Their whispers filling the oak-paneled room. Harrison's attorney, a seasoned family court specialist, arranged a portfolio of evidence on the polished table. Vanessa arrived moments later, perfectly composed in designer attire, flanked by her own legal representation. She cast a cold glance toward Harrison before taking her seat. The 6-year-old girl sat in a separate room with a court-appointed advocate, spared from witnessing the battle that would determine her immediate future. "Your Honor," Harrison's attorney began, "we have evidence suggesting Ellie has endured significant trauma while in Mrs. Harrington's care." She presented a collection of drawings Ellie had created during her brief stay at Harrison's mansion. The images spoke volumes: dark, confined spaces with tears drawn falling from stick figures, and one particularly haunting picture of a small child curled up on a bathroom floor. The judge studied each drawing carefully, her expression grave. "These were created spontaneously?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor. Without prompting or suggestion," Harrison confirmed, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. When Harrison took the stand, he recounted that rainy Thursday at the library, describing how the child's whispered confession had pierced through his grief. "I recognized the look in her eyes," he testified. "It was fear, but also a desperate hope that someone would finally listen." Vanessa's attorney attempted to paint Harrison as an unstable recluse, obsessed with replacing his deceased daughter. "Mr. Vale has no experience as a parent," he argued. "His interest in this child is merely a manifestation of unresolved grief." The socialite nodded emphatically, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. But when called to testify, inconsistencies in her explanations about Ellie's injuries and absences from school became apparent. The judge's decision came swiftly. "I am granting temporary custody to Mr. Vale, pending further investigation." She looked directly at Vanessa. "This court has significant concerns about the child's welfare in her current environment." Vanessa's composure cracked momentarily, her eyes flashing with fury. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the Edgehaven Chronicle gathered, sensing a story that would captivate the town for weeks to come. As Harrison left with permission to collect Ellie from the advocate's office, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but for now, the little girl would have a safe place to sleep tonight. Harrison Vale's ocean-front mansion had stood like a mausoleum for years, grand but lifeless, filled with antiques but devoid of warmth. Now the rhythmic sounds of hammers and saws echoed through its cavernous halls. Workers moved purposefully from room to room, removing heavy drapes to let sunlight stream through salt-sprayed windows. "What do you think about this color for your room?" Harrison asked, holding up a paint swatch in a soft sea green. Ellie nodded shyly, her small fingers tracing the color sample. The millionaire had emptied his checkbook for these renovations, but the expense meant nothing compared to the flicker of joy in the child's eyes. The master bedroom adjacent to Ellie's was transformed into a cozy sitting area where she could read or draw without feeling isolated. Harrison replaced the imposing antique furniture with child-sized bookshelves and comfortable seating. The kitchen, once a sterile showpiece, now hummed with activity as Clara taught her niece how to knead dough for fresh bread. "My dad used to make cinnamon toast," Ellie whispered one morning, her first voluntary mention of Lucas. Harrison exchanged a glance with his sister but kept his voice casual. "We should try making that tomorrow," he suggested, watching as the 6-year-old's shoulders relaxed slightly. Detective Monroe visited regularly, ostensibly to update Harrison on the investigation, but the private investigator had grown fond of Ellie. He brought her a sketchbook and quality-colored pencils, noticing how she expressed through art what she couldn't yet say in words. The most significant transformation wasn't in the physical space, but in the atmosphere. Music played throughout the house, gentle classical in the mornings, upbeat children's songs in the afternoon. The mansion that had once amplified Harrison's grief now echoed with tentative laughter. One evening, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows, Harrison found Ellie trembling in her bedroom. "Vanessa would lock the windows during storms," she confessed, eyes wide with remembered fear. Without hesitation, he sat beside her bed, telling stories until she drifted to sleep. In the library, Harrison's sanctuary, he cleared a special shelf for Ellie's growing collection of books. The rare first editions now shared space with colorful children's stories. When she asked questions about his daughter, Harrison found himself able to answer without the crushing weight of grief that had defined him for so long. The renovations weren't just about creating a home for a traumatized child. They were rebuilding Harrison himself. Each wall painted, each room brightened, each moment of progress with Ellie was healing something long broken in his heart. As Edgehaven whispered and watched, something remarkable was happening behind the mansion's freshly painted doors. Two wounded souls were beginning to heal each other. Vanessa Marshall stood at the center of the Edgehaven Country Club's veranda, tears glistening perfectly in her eyes as she addressed the ladies' auxiliary. "He's using my stepdaughter to fulfill some twisted fantasy about replacing his own child," she whispered, voice breaking at just the right moment. "Harrison Vale may have millions, but what he really wants is to steal my family." The calculated performance was just the beginning of Vanessa's carefully orchestrated smear campaign. Within days, whispers about Harrison's mental stability spread through Edgehaven like wildfire. The socialite made sure to appear vulnerable yet dignified at every opportunity, crafting the image of a grieving widow whose stepdaughter had been manipulated by a wealthy, unstable recluse. "I've known Vanessa for years," declared Judith Pembroke, wife of the town council president, during their weekly bridge game. "She's devoted to that child." This Vale character barely left his mansion until he decided to play hero. But not everyone in Edgehaven was convinced. Mrs. Lenley, the librarian who first heard Ellie's whispered confession, quietly shared her concerns with trusted friends. "That little girl was terrified," she insisted over coffee at the Harborview Cafe. "And not of Mr. Vale." The battle lines were drawn across the town's social landscape. At the Edgehaven Garden Society's spring planting, two longtime friends nearly came to blows over whose version of events they believed. The annual hospital fundraiser became a minefield of tense conversations and carefully chosen seating arrangements to separate the warring factions. Even Sunday services at St. Mary's Episcopal Church weren't immune. Reverend Phillips found himself delivering carefully worded sermons about judgment and compassion, while Vanessa sat prominently in the third pew, head bowed in apparent prayer, while Harrison and Ellie attended the later service. "She's brilliant at this," Harrison confided to Detective Monroe as they reviewed the growing list of allegations. "She's painting me as a deranged millionaire with a savior complex." The investigator nodded grimly. "Classic misdirection. While everyone's debating your motives, they're not looking at her behavior." What Vanessa hadn't anticipated was Ellie's growing confidence. Each day, in Harrison's care, the child stood a little taller, spoke a little louder. When they walked through town together, some residents noticed the difference, how she no longer flinched at sudden movements, how she occasionally even laughed. "I don't care what they're saying about me," Harrison told Clara during a rare phone call, "but I won't let her poison the town against Ellie." As Edgehaven's summer gala season approached, the social battlefield was set. Vanessa had the power of rumor and long-established connections, but Harrison had resources of his own and the quiet, undeniable truth of a 6-year-old girl, finally learning what safety felt like. In the warm glow of Harrison Vale's renovated kitchen, Ellie sat cross-legged on a stool, stirring hot chocolate with a concentration that belied her 6 years. 3 weeks into her stay, the shadows under her eyes had begun to fade. "Daddy didn't just go away," she said suddenly, her small voice steady. "He said goodbye. He hugged me really tight and said he'd come back for me." Harrison leaned against the counter, careful to keep his expression neutral despite the tightening in his chest. "Did he say where he was going?" "On a business trip." That's what Vanessa told everyone. Ellie's spoon clinked against the mug. But he packed his special watch, the one from Grandpa. He never takes that on regular trips. These quiet revelations came more frequently now, fragments of memory surfacing as Ellie felt secure enough to voice them. Harrison recorded each one discreetly on his smartphone, building a timeline that grew increasingly troubling. Later that evening, after tucking Ellie into bed, he called Detective Monroe. She mentioned strange men visiting the house. Harrison explained, pacing the hallway. Business partners, Vanessa called them. They would come late, and Ellie was told to stay in her room. Interesting, the detective replied. That matches what I found in Lucas's banking records. Large cash withdrawals before his disappearance, not consistent with someone planning to abandon his daughter. Monroe had been methodically dismantling Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative. The investigator discovered that Lucas's supposed farewell email to his employer had metadata showing it was sent 3 days after his boat was reported missing. Someone else had accessed his account. The harbor master's log doesn't match her statement either, Monroe continued. The weather was clear the day Lucas supposedly took the boat out. No storm warning, as she claimed. Harrison glanced toward Ellie's room, where a nightlight cast star patterns across the ceiling. What about the visitors Ellie mentioned? Working on identifying them. One name keeps coming up. Gregory Winters. He's been seen with Vanessa at the country club several times since Lucas vanished. The following morning, Clara arrived with breakfast pastries and news. I spoke with Lucas's old assistant, she said, pouring coffee. She remembered Vanessa insisting on handling all his mail and messages those last few weeks. Harrison nodded, pieces falling into place. She was isolating him. Outside, rain tapped against the windows as Edgehaven carried on with its routines, unaware of the truth emerging within the mansion's walls. In her room, Ellie painted with new watercolors, a small boat on dark water, a distant lighthouse beam cutting through fog. The investigation was intensifying, light finally reaching the shadows that had enveloped her family for too long. The Edgehaven Grand Hall sparkled under crystal chandeliers as the annual charity gala reached its peak. The town's elite mingled in their finest attire, champagne flutes clinking amid polite laughter. Vanessa stood near the center, a vision in emerald silk, graciously accepting condolences about her difficult situation with practiced humility. Harrison Vale arrived fashionably late, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the reclusive figure he'd been for years. Whispers followed him across the marble floor. Several guests noted the subtle transformation in his demeanor, a man with purpose rather than one haunted by grief. I didn't expect to see you here, remarked Mrs. Lenley, the librarian who had first heard Ellie's confession. How is she doing? Finding her voice, Harrison replied, his hand resting on the device in his pocket. Across the room, Vanessa's smile faltered when she spotted him. She quickly composed herself, turning to the mayor's wife with a practiced sigh. He's made this all so difficult, turning a child against her only remaining parent. Harrison approached the small stage where donors were being recognized. When the microphone was offered, he thanked the community for their support of children's causes. Speaking of children, he continued, his voice steady, I believe we should listen to what they have to say. He produced Ellie's toy tablet and pressed play. The room fell silent as Vanessa's voice filled the space. Harsh, threatening, nothing like her public persona. If you tell anyone about last night, you'll never see your father again. Do you understand me? Gasps rippled through the crowd. The recording continued with Ellie's tearful promises to be quiet, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door locking from the outside. Vanessa lunged toward the stage, her face contorted with rage. That's fabricated! He's manipulating a child! Several guests stepped back, creating distance between themselves and the woman they'd championed at garden parties and church gatherings. Detective Monroe, present as Harrison's guest, observed the reactions carefully. You can't do this to me, Vanessa hissed, grabbing Harrison's arm. This is my town. No, he replied quietly. This is Ellie's future. The gala dissolved into factions, some rushing to comfort Vanessa, others approaching Harrison with questions and concerns. Judge Patterson, who had presided over the initial hearing, exchanged a meaningful glance with Harrison before departing. By midnight, the ballroom had emptied, but Edgehaven was wide awake with phone calls and text messages. The carefully maintained veneer had cracked, and through that crack, uncomfortable truths were seeping into the town's consciousness. As servers collected abandoned champagne glasses, Detective Monroe approached Harrison. You've started something that can't be stopped now. Harrison nodded. That was precisely the point. The court had granted Harrison Vale permission to collect some of Ellie's belongings from Vanessa's house. Detective Monroe accompanied them, keeping a watchful eye as the 6-year-old wandered through her old bedroom, touching familiar objects with a mix of longing and apprehension. "Can I take Mr. Whiskers?" Ellie asked, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. Harrison nodded, his eyes softening. "Of course. Anything that's yours?" While the detective supervised the collection process, Ellie drifted toward her closet. Something had always bothered her about the loose floorboard inside, a secret she'd never shared with her stepmother. Kneeling down, she pressed her small fingers against the edge until it lifted. "What did you find there, sweetheart?" Harrison asked, noticing her concentration. Ellie reached into the dark space beneath and pulled out a folded piece of paper, torn at one edge. "It's Daddy's writing," she whispered, her voice trembling with recognition. The private investigator moved closer as Harrison gently took the letter. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged in places. "My dearest Ellie, when you read this, we'll be far away from here. I've found us a place where Vanessa can't. The rest was missing, torn away as if in haste or anger. He was going to take me away," Ellie said, her eyes wide with realization. "He didn't leave me behind on purpose." Harrison exchanged glances with Detective Monroe, whose professional demeanor couldn't hide his interest. This fragment contradicted Vanessa's story about Lucas leaving on a business trip and never returning. "May I keep this safe for you?" the detective asked Ellie. "It might help us understand what happened to your father." That night, back at Harrison's mansion, Ellie couldn't sleep. She sat by the window overlooking the ocean, clutching Mr. Whiskers and whispering stories about her father, memories of pancake breakfasts and beach walks before Vanessa entered their lives. Harrison found her there, a small silhouette against the moonlit glass. "Do you think he's still looking for me?" she asked. "If he is, we'll help him find you," Harrison promised, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his chest. The next morning, Detective Monroe arrived early. "I've spoken with my contacts," he said, spreading documents across Harrison's antique desk. "Lucas's supposed business trip never existed. His company has no record of sending him anywhere." Harrison studied the timeline they were piecing together. So he was planning an escape, not abandonment. And something, or someone, stopped him, the detective concluded, his gaze drifting toward the garden where Ellie was planting flowers with Clara. For the first time since her whispered confession in the library, Ellie had something tangible to hold on to, proof that her father had wanted her, had planned for them both. It wasn't much, but in her small hands, that torn letter felt like the beginning of an answer. The annual Edgehaven Antique Fair, normally a genteel affair of polished silver and mahogany, had transformed into something altogether different. Whispers followed Harrison Vale as he guided Ellie through the crowded pavilion, her small hand clutched tightly in his. "That poor child," murmured Margaret Winters, the bakery owner, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Vanessa always seemed so put together at my shop. Who would have thought?" Her husband Harold shook his head. "We don't know the whole story. That millionaire swooped in awfully fast, if you ask me. Men like him always have. Angles." This division had become Edgehaven's new normal. The coastal town, once united by its pristine beaches and historical charm, now found itself fractured along invisible lines. At Sunday service, Pastor Williams delivered a sermon on judgment without knowledge, while half the congregation nodded toward Vanessa's usual pew, and the other half glanced meaningfully at Harrison's sister Clara, who had begun attending regularly. The elementary school became another battleground. Parents whispered during pickup, forming clusters that either condemned Vanessa's treatment of her stepdaughter or questioned Harrison's motives. Teachers noticed children taking sides in playground games, some refusing to play with those whose parents supported the wrong side. "I heard he's buying the judge," said Francine Porter at the Seaside Women's Auxiliary meeting. "My husband's cousin works at the courthouse and says Vale's been seen having lunch with Judge Harmon twice." Elizabeth Donovan, the town librarian who had witnessed Ellie's first confession, slammed down her teacup. "And I suppose Vanessa's sudden donation to the courthouse renovation fund is just coincidence? That child was terrified when she came to my library. I saw it with my own eyes." Detective Monroe observed these divisions with professional detachment as he continued his investigation. The private investigator noted how the custody case had become less about Ellie's welfare and more about Edgehaven's own identity crisis. Was it truly the picture-perfect community it pretended to be? Even the Chamber of Commerce meeting devolved into heated debate when Harrison's name appeared on the annual donor list. The town's summer festival committee split into two planning groups, one accepting Vale's contribution, the other refusing it on principle. Through it all, Ellie continued her art therapy, painting scenes of lighthouses, standing firm against crashing waves. Her teacher noticed how the child seemed to grow stronger, even as the adults around her fractured into warring camps. The custody case no longer belonged to just Ellie and her family. It had become Edgehaven's own reckoning with the difference between appearance and truth. The doorbell echoed through Harrison Vale's mansion on a foggy Tuesday morning. He opened the door to find a woman with familiar eyes standing on his doorstep, a small suitcase at her feet. Clara Vale shifted uncomfortably, the weight of 5 years of silence hanging between them. "I saw the news," she said simply. "About the little girl." Harrison hesitated before stepping aside to let his estranged sister enter. Their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and accusations about their parents' estate. Now she stood in his foyer, examining the toys scattered across what had once been an immaculate space. "You've changed things," Clara observed, running her fingers along a colorful painting hung at child height. "It's warmer now. Ellie needs a home, not a museum," Harrison replied, his voice guarded. "Why are you really here, Clara?" His sister set down her purse and faced him directly. "I should have been there when Sarah died. I was wrong to stay away." The mention of his daughter's name made Harrison flinch. "I can't change that, but I can help you fight for this child." That evening, as Ellie colored at the kitchen table, Clara prepared dinner, moving around the kitchen with cautious determination. The child watched her with curious eyes. "Are you Harrison's sister? You have the same eyebrows?" Ellie asked, adding another stroke to her drawing. Clara smiled. "Yes, I am, and you must be the artist I've heard about." Later, after Ellie had gone to bed, the siblings sat in the living room, reviewing case files. Clara, with her background in family counseling, offered insights Harrison hadn't considered. "Vanessa's using the community against you," she explained, organizing documents into neat piles. "We need to focus on building allies, not just evidence." Days turned into weeks as they established a tentative rhythm. Old wounds surfaced, arguments about their parents, Clara's absence during Harrison's darkest days, but each confrontation ended with a fragile truce, strengthened by their shared purpose. When Harrison received notice of another emergency hearing, Clara stayed up all night preparing talking points. The next morning they walked into the courthouse together, a united front that visibly unsettled Vanessa. "I never thought I'd see the Vale siblings together again," whispered Mrs. Lenley to Detective Monroe as they watched from the gallery. That night, after a small victory in court, Harrison found Clara teaching Ellie to make paper boats in the kitchen. "We're sending wishes downstream," his sister explained. "Like messages in bottles," Ellie added seriously. Harrison watched them, realizing that in fighting for Ellie's future, he was somehow reclaiming pieces of his own past. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret Chen, Ellie's biological aunt, approached the witness stand. Lucas's sister had flown in from Seattle after learning about the custody battle through national news coverage. With her chin held high and hands clasped tightly together, Margaret took the oath, her eyes briefly meeting Ellie's across the room. "I lost contact with my brother 3 years ago," she explained, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Lucas had been calling me regularly, expressing concerns about Vanessa's behavior toward him and especially Ellie." Harrison Vale leaned forward in his seat, watching intently as Margaret produced a small photo album. The attorney carefully entered it as evidence, and soon photographs of a younger, smiling Lucas with his daughter circulated among the court officials. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Lucas called me in the middle of the night, Margaret continued. He said he was planning to leave Vanessa and asked if Ellie and he could stay with me temporarily. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, whispering urgently to her lawyer. The judge silenced them with a stern glance. Margaret recounted how Lucas had described incidents of emotional manipulation, financial control, and growing concern for Ellie's well-being. She produced emails and text messages that directly contradicted Vanessa's previous testimony about the state of their marriage and Lucas's intentions. "My brother was not planning an extended business trip," Margaret stated firmly. "He was planning an escape." When cross-examined about her long absence from Ellie's life, the aunt's composure briefly faltered. "Vanessa told me Ellie wanted nothing to do with me," she explained, tears welling in her eyes. "She said Lucas had left the country willingly. I tried calling, sending gifts, Everything was returned. Detective Monroe nodded slightly from his position at the back of the courtroom. This aligned perfectly with evidence he had been gathering about Vanessa's systematic isolation of both Lucas and Ellie from extended family. During a brief recess, Ellie ran to her aunt, embracing her with such force that both nearly toppled over. Harrison watched the reunion, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. Clara squeezed her brother's hand in silent support. When proceedings resumed, Margaret presented a timeline of Lucas's final days before disappearing, including his visit to a lawyer, specializing in custody cases and withdrawals from a secret bank account Vanessa knew nothing about. The judge reviewed the new evidence carefully, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This testimony substantially alters our understanding of the circumstances," she noted. "We will need to reassess Mrs. Chen's claims against existing evidence." As the session concluded, the truth about Lucas's disappearance seemed tantalizingly close, yet still shrouded in mystery. For Ellie, however, one truth was beautifully clear. She wasn't alone anymore. Ellie Vale stood before her canvas, paintbrush trembling slightly in her small hand. The art teacher at Edgehaven Elementary had encouraged students to express their deepest feelings through color and form for the regional children's art competition. For the 6-year-old, this wasn't merely an assignment, it was liberation. "What are you painting today?" Harrison asked gently, watching from the doorway of the sunlit studio he'd created in the east wing of his mansion. She didn't answer immediately, focused on applying bold strokes of midnight blue against a backdrop of shadowy grays. The girl worked with surprising intensity, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The canvas revealed a small figure, curled in darkness, a sliver of light visible beneath what appeared to be a door. Over the following weeks, Ellie created a series of paintings that told her story without words. Each canvas captured moments from her life, the bathroom lock glowing ominously in the dark, a child's hand reaching toward a window, and finally, a little girl standing in sunlight, surrounded by clockwork gears that resembled Harrison's collection. When the art teacher saw the collection, tears welled in her eyes. "These need to be seen," she whispered, immediately entering them in the New England Youth Art Exhibition. The day of the exhibition arrived with unexpected fanfare. Local media covered the event, drawn by the remarkable depth of emotion in a 6-year-old's work. Art critics praised the technical skill and raw emotional honesty. When Ellie's name was announced as the winner, the applause thundered through the gallery. "Can you tell us about your paintings?" a reporter asked, kneeling to Ellie's height, device recording. "They're about being scared and then not scared anymore," she replied simply, holding Harrison's hand. The story spread beyond Edgehaven's boundaries. A prominent Boston newspaper ran a feature on the child artist whose paintings speak volumes. National morning shows requested interviews. Photographs of Ellie's artwork appeared online, accompanied by discussions about child welfare and the power of art therapy. For Vanessa, this publicity was catastrophic. Her carefully constructed image crumbled as strangers across the country analyzed paintings that clearly depicted abuse. Social media erupted with support for the child and condemnation of those who had failed to protect her. Clara organized an expanded exhibition at a prestigious gallery in Boston, with proceeds benefiting child advocacy organizations. Detective Monroe stood quietly at the back during the opening night, watching as Ellie's truth, rendered in paint and courage, accomplished what his investigation alone could not. It made people truly see. For Harrison, watching Ellie accept her award with quiet dignity was worth more than any business success in his life. The girl had found her voice, and all of New England was listening. Miss Olivia Winters sat in the Edgehaven Elementary conference room, her hands trembling as she faced Detective Monroe. The weight of her silence had become unbearable. "I should have said something months ago," she whispered, voice cracking. Ellie would come to class with dark circles under her eyes. When I asked, she'd say she couldn't sleep because the bathroom was too cold. The detective leaned forward, recorder running. "And you didn't report this?" "I tried," Olivia replied, wiping away tears. "I spoke to Principal Garner, but he reminded me of Vanessa's position on the school board. Then, at the winter fundraiser, Vanessa cornered me, mentioned how difficult it would be for a teacher with my limited experience to find work elsewhere." She stared at her hands. "I was a coward." Word of the teacher's confession spread through Edgehaven like wildfire. Harrison Vale received the news, in his study, where Ellie was safely drawing nearby. The millionaire's face hardened as Detective Monroe detailed the teacher's statement over the phone. "She described 3 separate incidents," the investigator explained, "including a day when Ellie came to school in the same clothes as the day before. smelling of urine. Social services moved with unprecedented speed. Within 24 hours, 2 investigators arrived at Harrison's mansion to interview Ellie. Clara, Harrison's sister, sat beside the child, offering gentle reassurance as Ellie described nights spent huddled on the bathroom floor. "Vanessa said I was being punished for spilling juice on her dress," the 6-year-old explained, her small voice steady despite the horror of her words. "Sometimes she forgot to unlock the door before leaving for work." Across town, other teachers began coming forward. The physical education instructor recalled Ellie's reluctance to change for swimming lessons, hiding bruises on her arms. The school nurse admitted to overlooking suspicious marks after receiving calls from Vanessa, explaining them away as playground accidents. The investigation expanded beyond the school. Mrs. Lenley from the library provided her detailed notes of Ellie's concerning behavior. The pediatrician who had treated Ellie twice for dehydration now questioned Vanessa's explanations. Detective Monroe compiled the growing evidence methodically. "The community protected the wrong person," he told Harrison during their evening briefing. "But that's changing now." That night, as Harrison tucked Ellie into bed, she asked a question that pierced his heart. "Will I have to go back to her house?" He smoothed her hair gently. "No, sweetheart. The truth is coming out now, and the truth will keep you safe." Outside, reporters gathered at the edge of the property, the story of Edgehaven's collective blindness now spreading beyond the town's carefully maintained borders. Harrison Vale sat alone in his study, surrounded by antique clocks ticking in perfect unison. The safe before him, hidden behind a painting of the Edgehaven coastline, had finally yielded its secrets. With trembling hands, he spread the photographs across his mahogany desk, each image telling a fragment of a story he'd suspected but couldn't prove. "My God," he whispered, studying a picture of Lucas with Ellie as a toddler. Attached was a handwritten note detailing plans to leave Edgehaven, escape Vanessa's control, and start fresh somewhere on the West Coast. Bank statements showed withdrawn funds, and there were printouts of rental properties in California. Lucas had been planning everything meticulously, until he vanished. Harrison called Detective Monroe immediately. "I've found something you need to see," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Lucas was planning to leave with Ellie. These photos, these documents, Vanessa must have known. Across town, Clara was picking Ellie up from art class when her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Lenley at the library. "Vanessa just listed the house. Realtor friend says cash offer. Closing tomorrow." Clara's heart raced as she quickly scanned the playground, spotting Ellie's blonde head bobbing near the swings. "Time to go, sweetheart," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Harrison wants to show you something special at home." What Clara didn't mention was the GPS tracker nestled in the unicorn keychain on Ellie's backpack, a precaution Harrison had insisted upon after their last court hearing. The device had seemed excessive then. Now it felt like providence. At Vanessa's house, suitcases were being loaded into a waiting car. The stepmother had told neighbors she was taking Ellie on a healing retreat following the stress of recent events. In reality, one-way tickets to Montreal sat in her purse, along with new passports. When Ellie didn't return from art class, Vanessa's carefully constructed plan began unraveling. She called the school in a panic, only to be told Clara had picked the child up, perfectly legal under their current custody arrangement. "She knows," Vanessa hissed, slamming down the phone. She grabbed her luggage and sped toward Harrison's mansion, blind with fury. She never made it past the gates. Police cruisers blocked the entrance, Detective Monroe standing calmly beside them with a warrant in hand. "Vanessa, Thompson," he said formally, "we have some questions about your husband's disappearance and your plans to leave the country." Inside the mansion, Harrison showed Ellie a photograph of her father holding her as a baby. "He never stopped loving you," he said gently, "and he never willingly left you behind." For the first time since entering Harrison's life, Ellie smiled without reservation. "I always knew," she whispered. Detective Monroe stood in Harrison's study, rain tapping against the windows as he laid out the manila folder on the antique desk. "I found him," he said, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Lucas is alive." Harrison Vale leaned forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the folder. The photographs inside showed a man with the same features as in Ellie's treasured family photos, but with a weathered face and distant eyes. Lucas had survived what appeared to be a boating accident 2 years ago, washing up on shore with severe head trauma and no identification. "He's been living in Millfield, just 40 miles inland," Monroe explained, "working as a handyman at a local motel." The doctors diagnosed him with retrograde amnesia. He calls himself Mark now. Clara gasped softly, her hand finding her brother's shoulder. The siblings exchanged a look of cautious hope. For 2 years, everyone had believed Lucas was dead or had abandoned his daughter. The truth was both simpler and more complex. "Does he remember anything at all?" Harrison asked, studying the surveillance photos of Lucas repairing a fence, living a quiet, isolated life. "Fragments only," the detective replied. "The neurologist I consulted believes familiar faces, particularly Ellie's, might trigger recovery, but there are no guarantees." That evening, Harrison and Clara drove to Millfield in silence, the weight of their mission hanging between them. They found Lucas, or Mark as he now called himself, in a modest diner, eating alone. The man who had once planned to rescue his daughter from Vanessa's control now lived in a world without memories, building a solitary existence from scratch. Their approach was gentle. Clara spoke first, introducing herself as someone who knew him before. Lucas looked up with confusion, then curiosity. There was no recognition in his eyes, but something in Clara's voice made him listen. "We believe you have a daughter," Harrison said carefully, sliding a photograph of Ellie across the table. "Her name is Ellie." Lucas stared at the picture, his fingers hovering above it. For a moment something flickered in his expression, a shadow of connection perhaps, or the ghost of memory trying to surface. "I dream about a little girl sometimes," he admitted quietly. "I thought they were just dreams." The road ahead would be challenging. The neurologist warned that recovery could be partial, painful, or might never fully come. Yet as they sat with Lucas in that small-town diner, showing him photographs and telling him stories of Ellie, Harrison felt a strange sense of completion. The missing piece of Ellie's puzzle had been found. As they prepared to leave, Lucas carefully tucked Ellie's photo into his wallet. "I'd like to remember," he said simply. "I want to try." Vanessa Winters stormed into her attorney's office, slamming a manila folder onto the polished mahogany desk. Her perfectly manicured nails trembled slightly as she pushed the documents forward. "These medical records prove Harrison Vale is mentally unstable," she insisted, her voice a controlled whisper. "Depression, anxiety, possible psychosis following his daughter's death. He's in no condition to care for a child." What the attorney didn't know was that Vanessa had meticulously altered the documents, changing dates and fabricating diagnoses from Harrison's grief counseling sessions years ago. It was her final desperate gambit to regain control of Ellie and the narrative that was quickly slipping away from her. Judge Harriet Simmons ordered an immediate psychiatric evaluation of Harrison. For 3 tense days, Edgehaven buzzed with speculation. Harrison submitted calmly to the evaluation, answering questions with the quiet dignity that had become his hallmark throughout the proceedings. "Mr. Vale displays remarkable emotional stability despite past trauma," the court-appointed psychiatrist testified the following week. "Furthermore, these supposed medical records contain numerous inconsistencies with hospital protocols." The courtroom fell silent as the psychiatrist continued. "These documents appear to have been deliberately falsified." All eyes turned to Vanessa, who sat rigid in her designer suit, her face a mask of practiced innocence that was beginning to crack around the edges. Meanwhile, across town, Gregory Ashford, Harrison's longtime business rival and Vanessa's secret ally, stood in the community art center, transfixed by a small canvas. The painting showed a child's hand reaching through darkness toward a sliver of light. The simple title card read, "Hope," by Ellie, age 6. Gregory had agreed to testify that Harrison was unstable in business dealings, supporting Vanessa's claims. But something about the small painting pierced through years of corporate animosity. The next morning, to Vanessa's horror, Gregory entered the courtroom and requested to speak. "I've known Harrison Vale for 15 years, he began. "We've been competitors, sometimes bitter ones, but I've come to realize something important." The businessman glanced at Harrison, then continued. "Vale has always been principled, even when it cost him. The man I see before you today, fighting for this child, is the same man I've always known, just with an open heart." Vanessa's attorney attempted to object, but the damage was done. The judge reviewed the psychiatric report alongside the forged documents, her expression growing increasingly severe. "Mrs. Winters," Judge Simmons finally said, "this court takes attempted fraud very seriously. These falsified records constitute a criminal offense." As court officers approached, Vanessa's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. The whispers that had begun with a little girl's confession in a library were now a deafening chorus of truth that even Vanessa could no longer silence. Ellie's artwork had gone viral overnight. The 6-year-old's haunting paintings, showcasing both her trauma and resilience, captivated audiences far beyond Edgehaven's shores. National news outlets picked up her story, and within days, the hashtag Justice for Ellie was trending across social media platforms. Harrison Vale watched from his oceanfront mansion as public sentiment shifted dramatically. The pressure on Vanessa mounted with each passing hour as comments flooded in from across the country. People shared their own stories of childhood trauma, creating a groundswell of support that no amount of social maneuvering could counter. "I've made a decision," Harrison announced during a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as the typically reclusive millionaire spoke with newfound conviction. "I'm liquidating the majority of my real estate holdings to establish the Ellie Foundation for Child Protection." The crowd fell silent as he continued. "Every child deserves safety, love, and the chance to be heard." His voice cracked slightly, the ghost of his own daughter's memory evident in his eyes. Clara stood beside her brother, squeezing his hand in solidarity. Detective Monroe received the call just hours later. A courthouse clerk, troubled by conscience, reported that Vanessa had approached Judge Harrington with an envelope containing $50,000 in cash. Security footage confirmed the exchange, and by sunset, Vanessa was being escorted from her home in handcuffs. "You've ruined everything," she screamed at the officers, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "Do you know who I am in this town?" The emergency hearing the following morning was brief but decisive. Judge Wilson, brought in from a neighboring district, reviewed the evidence of attempted bribery alongside the mounting documentation of Ellie's mistreatment. "The court finds the respondent's actions reprehensible and disqualifying," the judge declared, her gavel striking with finality. "Vanessa Carter is hereby removed from all custody considerations regarding the minor child." As Vanessa was led away, her designer outfit contrasting sharply with her disheveled appearance, the socialite who once ruled Edgehaven's elite circles found herself utterly alone. Former friends averted their eyes, the same people who had once laughed at her dinner parties now whispering about her downfall. Back at Harrison's home, Ellie sat with Clara, unaware of the day's dramatic developments. She was painting again, this time a lighthouse standing firm against crashing waves. "Do you think my dad will ever see my paintings?" she asked, her small hand steady as she added details to the beacon's light. Clara smiled gently. "I believe more people than you can imagine are seeing your light right now, sweetheart." The morning sun cast golden rays across the Edgehaven coastline as Lucas Winters stood transfixed before the television in his small inland apartment. On screen, a familiar little girl with bright eyes spoke about her artwork and her new life. Something stirred within him, fragments of memory crystallizing into recognition. "Ellie," he whispered, the name unlocking a flood of memories that had been trapped behind the wall of amnesia for 2 years. Within hours, Lucas was driving toward Edgehaven, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Detective Monroe had arranged the meeting at the cliffs, neutral ground where the ocean's vastness could absorb the intensity of emotions about to unfold. Harrison Vale arrived first with Ellie, his tall figure protective beside the child as they waited on the windswept promontory. Clara stood nearby, her presence a testament to the healing that had occurred between the siblings. When Lucas appeared at the path's end, time seemed to stop. Ellie froze, her small hand clutching Harrison's. Then recognition dawned in her eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered, the word carried away by the sea breeze. "Ellie Bear," Lucas choked out, using the nickname only he had ever called her. The little girl broke free, running across the grass with abandon, her father dropping to his knees to catch her. Their embrace spoke volumes of lost time, of suffering endured, of love that had somehow survived against impossible odds. Harrison watched, his eyes moist. This moment of reunion was bittersweet, joyous for the child he'd come to love, yet echoing the daughter he would never hold again. Clara slipped her hand into her brother's, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and healing. 3 days later, in the hushed courtroom, Ellie stood before the judge, a folded paper clutched in her hands. The final custody hearing had transformed into something more meaningful, a ceremony of family redefined. "My daddy came back to me," she read, her voice small but steady. "And Harrison saved me when I was scared. Clara makes pancakes shaped like animals. We're all going to live together in the big house by the sea." The simplicity of her words moved everyone present. The judge, who had presided over the entire painful case, smiled gently as he finalized the unusual arrangement. joint custody between Lucas and Harrison, with Clara as a guardian. Outside the courthouse, Vanessa's empty chair at the defendant's table symbolized the final collapse of her control. Meanwhile, Edgehaven itself seemed to exhale, as if the town, too, had been holding its breath. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Harrison, Clara, Lucas, and Ellie, they formed not just a family reborn, but a promise to the community that sometimes when a child whispers her truth, the world can change for the better.